China's Coast Guard move near Taiwan shows how a crisis could begin without a shot. The patrol that turns Taiwan's eastern sea into a warning. China has launched a new Coast Guard patrol east of Taiwan, and the move matters because it shifts pressure into waters that Taiwan says Beijing has no right to police. China's Coast Guard says the fleet will conduct law enforcement patrols and strengthen activity in what Beijing calls Chinese jurisdictional waters. Taiwan has condemned the operation as illegal and disruptive, while its Coast Guard says it is tracking Chinese vessels and positioning its own ships to monitor them. The deeper pressure is not the patrol alone. It is the method. Beijing is increasingly using Coast Guard vessels, legal language, and maritime enforcement claims to press Taiwan without immediately making the crisis look like a naval attack. That is why this story sits beside the broader danger explored in What If China Invaded Taiwan in 2027? Because the question is no longer only whether China invades. It is how far China can normalize control before the world agrees that a red line has been crossed. The hard fact is simple, and the implication is not. The confirmed position is that China has sent Coast Guard ships into waters east of Taiwan for the second time in roughly a month. Taiwan's Coast Guard said 2 Chinese ships were being tracked, and that 2 Taiwanese ships had been prepositioned to sail alongside them. As of mid-morning on Saturday, the Chinese ships were reported 54 nautical miles east of Hualien, outside Taiwan's restricted waters but close enough to carry obvious strategic weight. That location matters. Hualien is not a random point on the map. It is home to a major airbase and sits on Taiwan's eastern side, the side often treated as more protected than the Taiwan Strait itself. If China can turn the waters east of Taiwan into a repeated enforcement zone, it widens the pressure map around the island and makes any future coercive campaign harder to read in real time. Beijing is turning jurisdiction into a weapon. China's Coast Guard said the patrol would safeguard China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights. Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council rejected that completely, saying Beijing has no sovereignty-related rights, jurisdiction, or law enforcement authority in the waters east of Taiwan. That is the legal collision at the center of the story. China is trying to act as if authority already exists, while Taiwan is trying to stop repetition from becoming precedent. This is why Taiwan calls the approach lawfare. The tactic is not only to send ships. It is to attach official language to the ships, repeat the operation, describe it as routine, and force others to respond to Beijing's version of the map. The danger is that a Coast Guard patrol can look less dramatic than military drills, while still carrying the same strategic purpose, narrowing Taiwan's room for independent control. The boarding question changes the risk. Taiwan has already told ships off its east coast to ignore any boarding or inspection demands from China's Coast Guard. A senior Taiwanese official said vessels should notify Taiwan's Coast Guard and not respond to what he called so-called boarding inspections. He also said Taiwanese Coast Guard vessels would intervene if necessary by sailing between ships to separate them. That is where the crisis could become physical without becoming a formal war. A demand for inspection, a refusal, a shadowing maneuver, a Taiwanese vessel placing itself between 2 ships, and a Chinese response would all happen in the gray zone between policing and conflict. It would not need a missile launch to become dangerous. It would only need one side to decide that backing down would damage sovereignty. This is bigger than one patrol. China said its first operation in June was linked to Japan and the Philippines planning formal maritime boundary talks, which Beijing viewed as involving Chinese waters off Taiwan. China's Ministry of Natural Resources later published an English-language legal opinion saying Japan and the Philippines should hold talks with China and not engage with Taiwan. That turns a Taiwan security issue into a wider regional contest involving Japan, the Philippines, and the legal status of waters around the island. The move also fits a wider pattern visible in China military activity near Taiwan. Taiwan has faced regular Chinese aircraft, naval, and official ship activity around its territory. The new pressure is that Beijing appears to be expanding the toolkit, using Coast Guard and quasi-civilian enforcement assets alongside military presence. That makes the pressure harder to classify, harder to deter, and easier for Beijing to repeat. The West is watching a threshold problem. The United States, Britain, France, and Germany have all expressed concern about Chinese actions off eastern Taiwan. That matters because the patrol is not only a bilateral Taiwan-China dispute. It touches shipping, alliance credibility, regional deterrence, and the question of whether Beijing can slowly redefine the maritime environment before a major crisis arrives. The West's problem is that gray zone pressure is designed to make every single response look too dramatic. If China sends warships, the military meaning is obvious. If China sends Coast Guard vessels and calls the operation law enforcement, outside powers must decide whether to treat it as policing, coercion, or the early architecture of a future blockade. That ambiguity is the weapon. The blockade risk is not theatrical anymore. A blockade does not have to begin with a cinematic announcement. It can begin with patrol zones, inspection demands, vessel harassment, legal claims, and repeated enforcement language. Taiwan says Chinese Coast Guard ships previously harassed commercial shipping by requesting origin and destination information and claiming jurisdiction. No boarding requests were reported during last month's patrol, but the instruction to ignore Chinese boarding demands shows that Taipei is already planning for that possibility. That is why what if China blockaded Taiwan for 30 days now reads less like a distant scenario and more like a live strategic question. A full blockade would be a dramatic act. A creeping maritime enforcement campaign is more subtle. It allows China to test reactions, gather operational experience, and pressure Taiwan while still leaving room to deny that it is escalating toward open conflict. Taiwan cannot let routine become reality. Taiwan's immediate task is to track, shadow, and challenge Chinese vessels without handing Beijing the clash it may be able to exploit. That is a narrow path. If Taiwan responds weakly, Beijing can repeat the operation and claim the area as a normal patrol zone. If Taiwan responds too aggressively, China can present itself as enforcing order against what it calls separatist resistance. This is the central trap of gray zone pressure. It punishes restraint by turning it into precedent, and punishes resistance by turning it into confrontation. Taiwan's response must therefore do two things at once: deny Chinese jurisdiction in practice, while keeping the encounter below the level at which Beijing can justify a larger move. The real story is control before conflict. The patrol east of Taiwan is not proof that war is imminent. It is more precise than that, and, in some ways, more worrying. It shows how China can use state power below the threshold of war to test the legal, political, and operational edges of Taiwan's sovereignty. The ships matter because they are not just ships. They are floating claims. That is the warning hidden inside this patrol. The future Taiwan crisis may not begin with an invasion fleet appearing on the horizon. It may begin with a Coast Guard vessel, an inspection demand, a legal statement, and a small patch of sea where Beijing decides the world has already learned to tolerate Chinese control.